Space, the final frontier. Wait, nope, wrong Star franchise. Of all such franchises, from your Gates to your Treks to your Battle Galacticas, one would be hard-pressed to argue against the cultural saturation of the wars, however one might feel about it. Indeed, the gaming sphere has as much history with Star Wars as any other medium, if not more. Under the stewardship of Lucasfilm and in partner with the late great legend of gaming LucasArts, Star Wars video games have been around nearly as long as the movies, with SNES's Empire Strikes Back coming out in 1982, a whole year prior to Return of the Jedi's theatrical debut. From X-Wing and TIE Fighter, to Dark Forces, to the Jedi Academy games and Knights of the Old Republic, the history of Star Wars games spans decades and encompasses entries both venerable and vitriolic. But time marches on, things change, institutions fall, and new powers rise. In the case of Star Wars and LucasArts, well, to paraphrase one of the best shows ever made, everything changed when the Mouse Kingdom attacked. Accompanying the sale of Lucasfilm and, by extension, Star Wars to Disney in late 2012, Star Wars was handed over to the control of the Mouseketeers as well. About 4 months later, in April 2013, LucasArts was shuttered, ending the era of one of gaming's most venerable institutions. Control of the Star Wars video game IP was given over to EA, a decision to which Star Wars fans reacted with their usual charitability, and what followed was a series of games that, without putting too fine a point on it, crashed like a 737. Thank goodness somebody at EA possessed some basic pattern recognition, and, in 2019, Respawn came to their rescue with the much-lauded Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Now, after all that build-up, you're probably asking yourself, man, what does Pat have to say about Fallen Order? Everybody pretty much agrees that game claps cheeks. First, that's crass and degenerate, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Second, we're not here to talk about Fallen Order. I loved Fallen Order. I clocked maybe 100 hours in Fallen Order across multiple playthroughs and challenge rooms. No, I simply wanted to establish thorough context so we could talk about the game I really wanted to talk about, Fallen Order's follow-up, 2023's Star Wars Jedi Survivor. As I'm sure you've assumed, I was one of the many fans of the first who is brimming with eager anticipation as the release of Survivor approached. Fallen Order had been a singular experience for me. The level design was interesting, the story was well written, the characters were compelling, and its combat comprised perhaps my favorite lightsaber dueling in any Star Wars game ever. All Respawn had to do was make another one with the same principles, and success was assured. Right? Well, that depends on who you ask. A rundown of Metacritic scores shows most major review outlets, from IGN to Screen Rant and the now undead Game Informer, scored Survivor in 9s and 10s or 90s and 100s or A's and A-minuses or whatever arbitrary rank they use to signify that game good me like. At this point, even the user reviews skewed toward the high 8s and overall average to a respectable 7.0. Even Steam reviews come in on the high side of mostly positive for an all-time with 68%. What's interesting about that, in as much as user-generated scores are interesting as the manifestos of famous serial killers, is how it contrasts with Fallen Order, whose Metacritic scores are solid C's but boast a strong B+ average on Steam. It's almost like there's no consistency in these metrics, and numerical scores are bantha poodoo. Now, in a cursory Google search, an aggregator we can always trust to be accurate, many of the top hits when searching Jedi Survivor directly ask if the game is as bad as they say or worth playing in 2025. Taking to Reddit and reviewing the worst of the vitriolic summations of Survivor give context to these questions. At launch, the game was riddled with performance issues from stuttering on micro and macro levels, FPS chug and crashes. While its best performance seemed to be on Sony's paperweight Station 5, even it saw its share of performance complaints, while Xbox did moderately worse, and PC gamers largely reported the game as a non-functional, unoptimized, crash-ridden, inexcusably broken sack of rusty nails. And, I don't know about you, but the last time I tried playing with a sack of rusty nails, I did not come away thinking it was Game of the Year material. So, what does this amount to? Critical reviews seem to shy away from mentioning performance as a detractor, while user reviews seem exclusively to focus on that. 2 years later, aggregate reviews seem to suggest the game's positive traits have outpaced its negatives, and in a time where the world has found a new, less EA-affiliated Star Wars game to fling bile at, it doesn't seem to get mentioned much at all, except by people who are checking to see if it's worth picking up. For many, such as myself, when games release in notoriously broken states, we decide to give them time to straighten themselves out before diving in. I'll talk more about that in my forthcoming essay on the subject of my darling Cyberpunk 2077, but suffice to say that was the decision I made with Jedi Survivor as well. I was coming into it expecting to love it as much as, if not more than, Fallen Order, so I was content to let it get on its Sunday best before meeting it. In a turn of serendipity, a year after launch, it came to Xbox Game Pass by way of EA Play in one of the oddest software centipedes I've yet encountered, and lowered the barrier of entry enough that any excuse I had to put off seemed null. Indeed, by that time, a year of patches had reportedly left it in the bare minimum functional state expected by any game at launch, so time to take the plunge it was. So in 2025, how do I feel about my 2024 playthrough of 2023's hottest Star Wars property? Well, I'd be lying if I said the game didn't make a good first impression. You're thrown into the action mid-heist in control of a Cal Kestis who hasn't lost his steps since his escape from Fortress Inquisitoris. It was a genuine surprise to start the game with all his in-game abilities intact, and even more of a surprise when you clear the introductory level and neither massive brain damage, Metroid back injury, nor Darkside contrivance had stripped away any of his virility. And speaking of the opening gambit, I was on board from the jump with a much more battle-hardened Ginger Jedi who had spent the intervening years between games getting rebellious with Saw Gerrera, the Rebel Alliance's own barely tolerated over-enthusiastic ends justify the means terrorist. A strong rapport is quickly established between Cal and his squad mates, a colorful band of misfits who all absolutely survived the mission, including a particular standout in the single dad-cum X-Wing pilot Bodo Kuna, but more on him later. It was a strong, if somewhat long, introduction that had a ton of great ideas and set a visceral and engaging tone for the rest of the game to build upon. Shame it went and squandered it. Yes, you bet you were thinking this was going to be a positive review, weren't you? As a warning, to really explain why this game roasted my chestnuts so severely, I'm going to have to dive into spoiler territory. We'll start with some light early game petting, then we'll dive into some mid-game waist-up teasing, then plunge in with third act, third base action before, like the game itself, we go limp and fall asleep before we finish. Okay, not the best way to tie up that metaphor, but I promise it'll come back around. So, when that strong opening gambit ends with things going properly memories ascendant, Cal seeks safety on planet Kobo with his old, previously four-armed, then three-armed, now four-armed again friend Grease. Through a series of truly outstandingly contrived events, he then finds himself in a lost Old Republic vault, wherein he learns of the game's MacGuffin du jour, a lost, nearly impossible-to-find planet called Tanalorr, hidden behind the impassable Kobo abyss. What follows is a race against the game's villains, to include a hulking tackle box called Ravis and a one-armed former Jedi turned emo band frontman called Dagan Gera, to reach the Lost World and document the dinosaurs, claim it for reasons which are cogent and well explained. Now, I would be remiss not to mention that when naming Dagon Guerrera in the previous paragraph, I did have to go Google his name because even from the jump, nothing about this handsome understudy was committed to my long-term memory aside from the fact that he spent all of your fights against him doing an amateurish Darth Kreia impression. 'Cause, one arm. Go play Knights of the Old Republic 2. It's good and you can get it on Android for less than the cost of a carton of eggs. Ravis I found a little more compelling because besides the fact that he's made of worms and really there aren't enough characters in modern fiction that are comprised of a swarm of arthropods, so it's worthy of note, that and unlike Dragon Gordita, the game actually establishes him, his lackeys, and his presence on Kobo as a genuine threat. I think that the idea was that by showing Ravis was more of a bag of snakes than salamanders and then establishing that he was Billy Ray Bad Guy's pretty little bitch, that any threat we attributed to one would, I guess, spread like COVID at a presidential rally? My point is, it's lazy writing. They spend a lot of time telling you how bad Doogie Gowser is, but every fight against him breezed by with less effort than your average tropical wampa, so it just never worked for me. The only real reason we're given to give even a single posterior soft serve about this guy is that he's also interested in the mysterious Lost World Tanalorr, which they assure us is super cool and made of chocolate or something, so it's totally worth the effort. Just trust us, guys. Now, we mentioned fighting there, and particularly the lack of challenge that our open quotes main bad guy presented, so before we finish feebly fumbling and fully unfasten Susie Spoiler's bra, let's talk marbles. By that, I mean gameplay marbles. What, is that not a phrase where you come from? Weird. Anyway, back to the intro, I talked about how Cal starts this game with all of his abilities from Fallen Order. That was a teensy fib, as the split saber attack from the endgame was missing, but that would trivialize the combat of this game to a point where playing it would almost become pointless, so I get why it was left out. For the combat, a few new things were added to mix up the existing formula. A two-saber stance, a pistol and single blade stance, and a we're still trying to convince you Kylo Ren was cool stance. Guys, I tried, okay? I tried to use the new stances, but every single time I would get even remotely challenged by anything using the new modes, I would switch back to the Fallen Order classic double blade and everything just worked better. I really wanted to like the 2 saber stance too, and Knights of the Old Republic games, seriously, they're really good. It's my go-to. Problem is, when we start with all the same abilities as before and then add new ones, the new ones have to actually be a step up from what came before. The 2 sabers doesn't have the single target power of the standard blade or multi-target utility of the double. The blaster is just slower and less effective than using the lightsaber you already have out, and it has to be charged by attacking anyway, and Kylo Ren still sucks. This all can be wrapped up in my overarching feeling of the gameplay in Survivor Far, Far Away. Everything about the game just feels so insubstantial. So like every game I played this on the hardest difficulty because I have self-esteem issues and beating video games at their hardest is the only way I can come. There was some good enemy design. The tropical wampas can eat a bag of licorice, but even I got pretty good at fighting eventually. The problem is, every bad guy that wound up a challenge were the ones who had one-hit insta-kill attacks, and there's very little in enemy design that I find more boring. Maybe this is just because I haven't yet flogged myself over the burning coals of Dark Souls. I actually just started my first ever playthrough for this video SO series, so stay tuned. But I found my Horn Nemesis by far the more compelling design and rewarding fight, and yes, I'm talking about you, Rancor. So the characters left me flaccid, and the gameplay failed to recover from its previous climax, so how did the game's emotional core and thrilling conclusion work for me? Well, I'll say first off that the returning cast of characters from Fallen Order are still charming and interesting, and I still ship Merrin and Cal hard. And regarding your buddies in gameplay, there are segments in the game where it teams you up with one of your bosom rebel buddies and unlocks some interesting team-based combat, like integrating Merrin's magic and Bode's jetpack. The thing is, I think they were onto something brilliant here, as those segments stick out in my mind most as highlights from my playthrough. I can envision a world where you had a teammate with you all the time, combining attacks and leveling them up, like in, say, Mass Effect 3, I like BioWare games if you couldn't tell, and getting something really interesting feeling, but that Respawn just didn't use it enough to see it to its full potential. There, I gave the game a compliment. Now back to why I hated it. So, we're done with the foreplay. The time for heavy petting is over, and we're ready to dive into full contact under the clothes stuff. So if you've still not played the game and wish not to get hot, sticky spoilers all over, now is the time to go home and finish yourself off. So you remember that guy Danny Godzilla or whatever his name was? Well, turns out he was every bit the chump I thought he was. Again, I was already lukewarm on the game, so when I was still a ways from the promised conclusion and had already given him a plasma vivisection, you can imagine how whelmed I felt. This is after the one bad guy I actually thought was interesting, the worm dude, remember? Went down with far less effort or narrative weight than I would have liked, so all told my enthusiasm was low and I was driving forward on the pure force of my sunk cost fallacy when the game dropped its other shoe. You remember that other guy I mentioned way back in the beginning, Bode Okuna? Well, slap my droid and call me M. Night Shyamalan. Turns out that guy was a Jedi. Also turns out he was working for the Empire, and after all the existing threats were dealt with and the relevant MacGuffin was obtained, he steals the MacGuffin and leads the Empire to your secret base. Betrayal! I'll be honest, this was a twist that made my eyes roll, and it took me a while to understand why. I understand he was supposed to be a foil for Cal, someone who faced a similar situation but made opposite choices, but what really got me was that he was a Jedi all along, as though he and his betrayal would be somehow less by just being a father trying to make a safe galaxy for his daughter without also making her an orphan. Thing is, I think it could have worked if the Jedi reveal came at some point before the grand betrayal, if we had some time to integrate the idea of him being a Jedi before being a traitor. And it's not that I'm averse to a good guy becomes a bad guy twist. There's a reason why names like Long John Silver and Kaiser Soze have become so famous in popular media. The thing is, I think a good twist needs to be at least a little telegraphed, so that when it happens, your reaction is, goodness, how did I not see that coming? Silver's betrayer in Treasure Island recontextualizes all his previous interactions with Jim. You spend the whole runtime of The Usual Suspects acclimating to the idea that there is a mystery to solve and another shoe to drop before it does, and it makes you want to immediately rewatch the movie to find all the hints that you were so thoroughly oblivious to the first time around. In Jedi Survivor, it feels like we have a twist for the sake of a twist. Bode's interest in Tanalorr and his relationship with Cal culminating in his ultimate betrayal felt narratively dissonant, like there were decisions made by two separate writers and two separate points of production, so ultimately his betrayal doesn't recontextualize anything. It just happens because somebody thought it should. The events around which it happened didn't help. Thrusting deeper into spoiler territory, after Cal's first confrontation with Bode, our boy is incapacitated incapacitated and their secret base is assaulted by Imperial forces, with none other than the big bad man himself, Darth Vader, leading the charge. With Cal out of commission, its defenses left to returning support Jedi Seer Junda. The subsequent section is a power fantasy romp through waves of stormtroopers that can make one wonder why she's not the protagonist, culminating in a one-on-one duel with the Darth. This is when the game commits its last sin, where after soundly defeating Mr. Vader, the game shouts "Psych!" and Vader kills Seer in the next cutscene. I was fully checked out of the story at this point. I was already frustratedly rolling my eyes, and then the game went and committed a primal gaming sin. I finished the game, but my heart really wasn't in it at that point. There's a final confrontation on Tanalorr. The good guy is victorious and probably turning to the dark side, and I walked away feeling like the game had done nothing but edged me with my own goodwill and then went home telling me to take a cold shower. See, I told you that metaphor would come back around. For a company like Respawn, who have gone from hit to hit in their career to include this game's predecessor, I came into Jedi Survivor with high expectations, and maybe that was on me. Perhaps my expectations were too high, but with combat that felt like a rehash of the original with no meaningful improvement and a story that failed to stick its own narrative landing, I couldn't help but come away feeling disappointed. It was certainly bigger, with grander aspirations and a ton of good ideas, but good ideas count for nothing if you flub the execution, which, in my opinion, they did. All of this to say, even with my lukewarm estimation of the game, I will jump into the third in the Star Wars Jedi series, which is confirmed to be in development, but we'll probably wait for Game Pass like I did here, and I'll probably do another of these essays on my thoughts when I do play it. I will, however, be going into it with far more tempered expectations, because having high expectations of something you love is the surest way to set yourself up for profound disappointment. Just ask your mother.